English translation 661st contact. Thursday, the 13th of October 2016, 16:08 hours.
Greetings again, dear friend. As well as to you, Quetzal, I extend my greetings. Unfortunately, Ptah, there was no other way, because Bernadette had to go to the kitchen to prepare dinner. But be welcomed.
I also greet you again, Edward, my friend. It is unfortunate, because it would have been only 3 or 4 minutes to finish our correction work.
I also greet you, my friend, but I immediately have to go outside to do my inspection work, which will take some time. Then I will come back.
Okay, I am sorry, Ptah, but
You have nothing to apologize for, because you are not responsible for the unpleasantness that could have been avoided. But what hurts you, dear friend, because I noticed during the correction work that you moved painfully several times.
first of all, I am fine again because of the suffering, and because of the pain, which I have had for 14 days, because the Friday before last a lumbago once again hit me, which is dragging on and doesn't want to get better. Although I received a painkiller from the doctor I had to see last Monday because of something else, it only works to some extent. The pain attacked me because I made a wrong movement or because I bent over too much, and that's when it happened. It is probably the case that I have moved too little with my back lately and have therefore provoked back muscle tension, which has become inflamed and has led to an acute outbreak of lower back pain by bending down.
Lumbago, or local lumbar syndrome, is actually the name given to the lumbago in which a sudden, stabbing, prolonged, extremely strong, and intolerable pain shoots into the backbone, especially in the lumbar vertebrae, making the body unable to move within seconds. The cause is usually of a functional nature, which you have rightly called muscular tension, which causes hardly bearable pain. This tension has developed over time because you have not moved your back muscles sufficiently, as you correctly mentioned. Your bending over was the acute trigger for this, because you brought the whole thing to its climax, so to speak, and thus the deep muscles reacted too slowly, shortened, contracted reflexively, and blocked the lumbar vertebrae, or the entire back, as you call it. But I don't want to leave that on you, which is why we go to my flying apparatus for a few minutes, where I can relieve you of the pain. So come on, it won't take long, about 5 minutes later, so how do you feel now, dear friend?
Again, completely painless normal. Thank you, that's good, thank you. We should have your medical knowledge and treatment options here on Earth. But this will probably take many more decades or centuries until Earth humans are even close to being there.
That's how it will be.
Then I have here the list of questions that we absolutely should clarify and that I have sent you about Florina so that you can decide about it.
That is what we did, Quetzal and I on the one hand, and the two of us together with our committee on the other. We have come to the conclusion that from now on you should act and solve various problems. When calling up and writing down the call, list the following in a clear manner. FIGU, Landesgruppe Information Bulletin 1A. With regard to a FIGU, Landesgruppe information publication. It should apply to all FIGU Landesgruppen worldwide that there is a need for it, but that such a need does not necessarily have to be periodic, but may be in sporadic form. Such a FIGU information leaflet shall apply to announcements to the passive members belonging to the respective FIGU Landesgruppe as well as to interested parties in order to notify them of FIGU stand actions to be carried out and their locations, as well as of FIGU meetings in the country group location. B. The FIGU Landesgruppe information letter can also be just a corresponding FIGU information letter from the FIGU Landesgruppe Executive Committee to pass on important information to FIGU Landesgruppe members, FIGU passive members affiliated to it, FIGU study group members, and FIGU interest group members. C. A FIGU Landesgruppe information bulletin may, if possible, contain factual articles, etc. of the FIGU Landesgruppe members, FIGU passive members, FIGU study group members, or FIGU interest group members, as well as necessary reports and publications which are of general importance or necessity for all members of a core group. Landesgruppe, passive group, study group, and interest group worldwide, as well as for interested parties outside the FIGU group. D. Important announcements, articles of a valuable nature and reports, news articles, experience reports, etc., as well as articles and GL-serving treatises, which are of importance, interest or importance in one's own country or worldwide, can be published by FIGU national groups, FIGU study groups, and FIGU interest groups, as well as their members in the 3-month periodicals Aquarian Age of the FIGU Mother Center, Switzerland. Members of FIGU national groups, FIGU study groups, and FIGU interest groups shall not be obliged but voluntarily to design and write articles, etc. Supervision of the FIGU national groups. Study groups and interest groups 2A FIGU national groups shall be self-governing, but exclusively under the patronage of the FIGU Mother Center, Switzerland, and shall be supervised from this by the FIGU Mother Center Core Group, but without direct delegation and without the presence of a core group member at national group meetings, unless in special cases an explicit FIGU Mother Center Core Group member presence is requested or required by any circumstances. B. Study groups and interest groups shall be under the patronage and supervision of the national groups, but without direct delegation and without the presence of a national group member at study group and interest group meetings, unless in special cases a national group member presence is explicitly requested or required by any circumstances. C. If national, study or interest groups organize GL study periods that do not fall within the scope of regular or irregular meetings, but serve purely GL study purposes. Nothing should prevent core group members or members of other groups from participating in such GL study programs.
Thanks. That would clearly settle these matters for once. Then I have this question. What is a genius?
Why do you ask? Because you know what a genius is.
Of course I know that, but I was asked what a genius was, but I did not want to present my own wisdom as an answer.
But what you should do now, because I want you to give an explanation, I could still correct your presentation, but I know that you will answer the question correctly.
You lead me into embarrassment, but if it should be, then I will describe the term genius as your father Svath taught me from his point of view, so that I understand a genius man to be something else than is generally the case with Earth humans. So a genius is not the traditional condemnation nonsense of a mental disorder close to insanity, or of a man who has fallen into insanity, or on the other hand of a divinely highly gifted and gifted man, but also not of an exceptional man with extraordinary spiritual abilities who excels his fellow human beings spiritually. Nor is a genius a poet or artist who is supremely gifted with divine powers, as was claimed and defined in the 18th century. Even if since ancient times numerous allegedly genial people have fallen into madness, insanity, severe mental disorders, or schizophrenia in their urge to create, their originality and intellectually highly productive phases, this does not mean anything special. Because the same thing has happened since all early times and still happens today and in all the future as well with ordinary people who in no way could or can be called geniuses. Geniuses do not exist in many different ways, but only in one relationship, because it is necessary to differentiate effectively between genius and talent. The talent man as such is not effectively a genius, but a talented or gifted person with special abilities or a gift, of which there may be several, in relation to an individual's ability for certain achievements, which may be work, subject, art, rhetoric, or anything else, but the whole of ingenuity, in any case, is directed towards respectful handling and respect and appreciation in every positive relationship. The essential thing about a genius, however, can be seen in his extremely diverse activity, originality, productivity, and comprehensive positive behavior, which emerge from his intuition and from constantly new creative areas. In my opinion, a genius man is a completely normal person, who however has outstanding qualities compared to other people. which he has either worked out extremely laboriously himself, or which correspond to a naturally inherited predisposition, which is then simply called genius. However, these characteristics are not simply oriented towards a specific field of work or specialization, but are based on the actual vital, positive behaviors, values, and appreciations as well as their practice, comprehension, and realization in daily life. And these factors are based in their value on respectful treatment and respect and esteem for others, nature, its fauna and flora, life itself, and general existence. This is for a genius, that is to say, a genius man, an immovable principle. Consequently, he is also polite, friendly, just and correct towards all people, but also open, loud, and in a hard way things. Misbehavior and problems can be made clear, but still the courtesy forms and inwardly the calm can keep. A genius is also always anxious to keep the house rules, but he does not recognize any class rules. But in his human evaluation, he puts all equal without distinction, following that he neither favors a person nor discriminates against him, even if one harms him or does him evil. Actually, a genius is also socially trained from the ground up and, in an earthly human sense, a social worker with great competence and a strong ability to teach social skills, which is also expressed by the fact that he gives expert advice to his fellow human beings and exemplifies the positive rules of conduct and behavior. This is also connected with the fact that he tolerates the differences in people's behavior just as much as he courageously stands up for the equality of all people, and thus also for the right of all races of people. The term genius refers back to the Latin language and to my knowledge meant protective spirit, but also, as I read a few days ago, according to the Latin verb genere, life generation. However, the term genius is also interpreted in a derogatory, negative way, for example as crushed existence, etc. Basically, however, a genius is a person with good and valuable talent and high-quality characteristics, great creativity and perfection, as well as comprehensive knowledge and high wisdom and equipped with ingenuity. Thus I understand in my sense a human being to be worth a genius who has extraordinary conscious abilities and is therefore in this sense a human being who has a high creative, logical, intellectual and rational power of consciousness, who thinks of and in many ways creates absolutely consciously progressive, good, instructive, and valuable things. Thus it can be inventions of every conceivable kind, as well as occupations, circumstances and behavior in the range of personal qualities, which are very diverse and express themselves among other things in the following values such as education, abilities of craftsmen, artistic and other work, as well as in relation to decency, behavior, manner, movement, character, existence, discipline, honor, etiquette, conduct, singing, habitus, and attitude. But there are also many other values that have to be ascribed to a genius human being, such as hobbies, childhood, comedy, art of all kinds, life forms of all kinds, learning, life theory, literature, poetry, manner, music, nature, philosophy, reactions, rhetoric, writing, language, dance, virtue, manners, knowledge, wisdom and dignity, etc. These values of a genius mean that such a man has for his fellow men and the whole human community a stimulating, instructive, progressive, protective, useful and also forward-looking path, which, if it is followed, can save individuals, many or even all of them, from disaster, if they follow the path which is given to them by a genius as a result of the life of values. And what I have now said has basically nothing to do with it if a person has, in relation to 2 or 3 special personal qualities, a profession, a thing or a job, a considerable talent, creativity, perfection, or a greater knowledge than is usual for normal people. But this does not constitute a genius and therefore not a genius, but nothing more and nothing less than a person with a somewhat above-average aptitude, more usefulness, skills, dexterity, efficiency, possibilities, qualification and routine, etc., for which he has worked out everything as a prerequisite or received it into life through inheritance. Of course I could add more, but I think that what has been said should be enough to describe a genius human being in his way, in his comprehensive interests, and in relation to his behavior, knowledge, and wisdom, etc.
You see, I could not have explained it better from my point of view, because what my father taught you as an explanation of what a genius is corresponds to our Playaran definition and teaching. So I'd like to add the following to your explanation. From our Playaran original language, we know the term and the meaning genius, which our ancestors brought to Earth about 13,500 years ago, but not as a word genius, but in the form as it is handed down from our original language and still in use today, namely as genogene. Translated from our original Playaran language into the German language, from time immemorial, the Playaran have been using the term Genigen to refer to the meaning worthy of respect, which would also have to be introduced into the German language in the same word value. This term, however, was already changed on Earth by Earth humans of the ancient Bronze Age, namely to genius, which originally meant protective spirit, as you mentioned, after which this new word formation was later also introduced into the language of the Latin tribe. As a result of linguistic misunderstandings caused by language mixtures, the term was changed again at the time of the Latin tribe, giving rise to the word eminence, which basically means excellent in the German language, and was introduced into it in further altered form as eminent. This resulted in the emergence of two new terms with two different new interpretations from the one original Playaran term Genigen on Earth, whereby the new term eminent also resulted in different perspectives on language terms and new ways of viewing and understanding, which are also used today with the same meaning as well as with various other meanings. Interpreted according to further earthly language values, eminent consequently has many other meanings than only outstanding, namely extraordinary, handsome, conspicuous, considerable, significant, remarkable, large, phenomenal, spectacular, fancy, pronounced, meaningful. Admirable, impressive, unique, disarming, noteworthy, respectable, enormous, impressive, abundant, amazing, grandiose, brilliant, epical, epic-making, etc., and so on. According to the term eminent, only the correct interpretation in the German language is effectively worthy of respect. Well, according to Earth human definition, a human being is called a genius if he has a so-called outstanding creative talent and mental power, or power of consciousness, whatever that means. In our Playaran sense, however, a genius is what you have said, but what I want to expand with it by saying that it is a fact that a person who can be described as a genius is extremely observant, attentive, and intellectually extremely original. Active, and in his activity also very creative and consequently constantly highly productive. Has energy, courage, dedication to goals, knowledge, honesty, optimism, judgment, enthusiasm, dynamism, certainty, openness, patience, versatility, adaptability, and tolerance, and is a person who brings humanity one step closer to a better life, culture, and future. A genius is very dutiful, has a great creative urge, and is not distracted by anything, as you have just explained. This in contrast to the non-geniuses, who as a rule are the simple and yet educated people, but somehow always wavering, because they have no or only a very weakly pronounced inhibition not to take a once-taken progressive good consciousness-building, intellect, reason, knowledge, and wisdom-wise way to the highest goal. Unfortunately, many people have little or no inhibitions in this respect to leave a good, rich, and valuable as well as progressive way of life, and to devote themselves to inferior ways of life, idleness, and uselessness. Only a man who is a true genius or who has a touch of genius-like impulses, as with regard to individual values, as you have listed them, for example with regard to the occupation and learning of the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life, or even spiritual teaching, rejects any uselessness and senselessness far from himself, for he walks the path to progress and success, to viability, and to the high goal of effective knowledge and wisdom. Consequently, He is also free from selfishness. Hatred, any egoistic, arrogant, confused, unfulfillable, and stupid thoughts and feelings is psychologically healthy and in top form, does not fail, and does not sink into his own misery. This means that he stands out in every respect from uncreative people in terms of their development of consciousness and behavior, etc., and is not susceptible to negative desires, demands, behaviors, and unpleasant desires, and therefore not a life failure. The misunderstanding regarding the interpretation of the terms genius, and genial, etc. already arose in early times, namely due to linguistic misunderstandings, because in earthly languages many necessary idiomatic expressions are not given, and the languages, except the German language, are very deficient. Thus, in earthly languages there are no words and expressions of the same meaning, no terms, notions, idioms, and fixed word combinations, no possibilities for the creation of terms and words, etc. In earthly languages, excluding German, the following properties of linguistic expressions, meanings of concepts and words, cannot be derived from the meaning of their components. This is only possible in and with the German language or German, but also in your mother tongue, Swiss German, which is not simply a dialect but an independent language like German. The explained is therefore the reason why the terms genius, and ingenuity, etc. were misinterpreted by terrestrial human beings and thus not understood what these terms really mean. This was due to the fact that these terms and words were not introduced into the old German language, from which German originated, but into various other earthly languages which, due to the lack of languages, were not able to be translated correctly. This led to various false translations, such as creative talent, highly gifted creative man, being translated in French as genie or spirit or extraterrestrial being. Furthermore, the interpretation excellent predisposition arose, in Latin genius as protective spirit, who was understood as a god ruling over man and accompanying him through life, and as the actual producer of life, especially from the Latin general and the even older form geniere, which means to produce, to bring forth, and to testify. But now I have to explain that unfortunately, as already mentioned, there is a completely wrong understanding regarding a genius or a genius human, which cannot be compared with a talent human, because genius and talent are fundamentally different factors and values. The great qualities and values of the genius human being are of an absolutely different nature than those of the talented human being, whereby especially the values relating to the concept of genius are completely misunderstood and misjudged by the Earth humans. The qualities of the genius human being are not simply focused on a specific field of work or expertise, etc., as is the case with the talent human being, but the genius qualities are based in the actual vital positive behaviors, values, and appreciations, as well as in their exercise, comprehension, and realization in daily life. And these factors mean in their value fundamentally the respectful handling and the respect and appreciation in relation to the fellow human beings, the nature, their fauna and flora, the life itself, and the general existence. These include peaceableness, coexistence, positive interpersonal relationships, integrity, compassion, freedom, and harmony. And finally, here's what I'd like to say. The action and behavior of the genius human can thus in no way be described as abnormal, nor as pathological, degenerate, irregular, or arbitrary exception. For from a human and sociological point of view, the whole corresponds to a progressive, cultural, rule-setting, formative, creative fertility, and human presentation of honor and dignity, and thus to the existence of true humanity. In the subconscious of a genius, valuable ideas emerge that other people lack, because a genius is not only very creative in his consciousness, but also in his subconscious, which through inspiration and intuition associates and combines imaginations, and from them forms ideas that penetrate into consciousness and evoke a special creativity. The idea is received with a high level of attentiveness, attention, and mental concentration, thereby awakening the ingenuity as well as the ability to create something new from an idea. Contrary to this is the talent man, who can be influenced by sensory stimuli and is therefore not strong enough concentratively. Compared to the genius human being, the talented human being is therefore much less. Lower and only latent, inhibited or even non-existent in terms of creativity, concentration, inventiveness, and the ability to create something new from an idea. The wealth of information regarding original thought connections regarding valuable ideas exceeds the talent man's ability to follow. As a rule, he can only talentedly turn to, dedicate himself to, and comprehend those things which correspond to his interest and do not exceed his intelligence. This is in contrast to the genius man, who leads his interests in various ways and is also able to expand his intelligence.
Earthly psychologists and other clever people, contrary to your statement regarding the expansion of intelligence, claim that it is not possible for the man of Earth to expand his intelligence. Then one more question. You said artwort in relation to eminent, just as your father Svath still used the word. But it has long since ceased to be used in the German language, because the property word, which was formerly called artwort or Beywort, was replaced by adjective.
Thank you for the correction, follow which I will turn my attention to it in the future. But we have already talked about intelligence, and I said that this assertion was nonsensical. Because people, including those on Earth, learn throughout their lives, even if it is extremely small for many, and their intelligence increases more or less as a result. And this learning process continues without interruption over the entire lifetime.
I already know that from your father Svath, of course also from your explanations. But now thank you for your explanations, by which also you make clear that a genius is something completely different than Earth humans usually believe to understand by it.
The explanations are probably necessary because the existing misunderstandings caused by the lack of earthly languages create a translation confusion, but this is very detrimental, and the whole...
Here I am again. If I interrupt your conversation, I'm tired of it.
into something that has nothing to do with a genius. But Quetzal, I have just finished my explanations, and now you can say what you have to say.
It was a pleasure for me to carry out my inspection work in the field, because all the work carried out in the entire field was to my complete satisfaction, and I am particularly pleased with the work carried out by Jacobus and his labor inspectorate. Everything was carried out by him, together with his staff, who must also be named, according to my sense and done, nothing to complain about, but to evaluate as very good work, and Jacobus is to be paid tribute for it. And it was really a lot of work that had to be done, and that also took a lot of time, but was worth it. So now the whole thing is in order, and a good new growth can result that has already begun and is progressing. And this is in contrast to forestry work and large felling by foreign forest owners, who leave great disorder behind after the forestry work, and thus deprive a good and valuable new growth of the possibility of a good development.
Thank you, and I think that Jacobus really did his best, and there is nothing to complain about.
That is of correctness. As well as of correctness is that the order in the entire area and around the center, as well as the gardens and everything else, need no objection, which also applies to the tree, shrub, and bush care, and my recognition is worthy.
That's also worth my thanks? But if I may now ask, what has your future vision in relation to resulted in?
Unfortunately, it has not turned out in such a way that your plans can be realized as you submitted them to me. The facts are, and unfortunately that cannot be changed. Nevertheless, you can still do something useful in this respect. And in the manner, if you keep to this and follow my instructions in this regard, there is nothing in store for you to prevent you from doing so or to cause you trouble.
Then at least in this way, which will also serve us well.
Then all you have to do is remember that...
That's obvious too. Thank you for all your efforts, Quetzal. Your clarifications clearly reveal what we can do.
Then I am to greet you from Zafanat Paneak and explain to you the following, which could be very important for you, but which should not be mentioned in an open way. It's a cryptograph that...
I got it. Entricta Zafanat Panich, my best thanks and also dear greetings.
That's what I wanted to say, and now I have to leave. Farewell, dear friend.
Likewise, Quetzal. Goodbye, and thank you again for all your efforts. Ptah, if you don't have to go yet, do I have 1, 2, or 3 more questions?
I'm in no hurry.
Then the following. Can you explicitly tell your opinion and that of the Plejaren in general about the USA and explain their machinations and behavior, etc.?
Today I would like to answer your question in some detail and give the facts and how we Plejaren, including myself personally, judge U.S. America with regard to politics, government, the military, and secret services, as well as the large part of the U.S. American population. It must be said that, according to our centuries-long exact records, assessments and determinations since the USA came into existence, very regrettable, criminal, bellicose, misanthropic, murderous, felonious, autocratic, and world domination-seeking circumstances have emerged from this united union of states and continue to exist. Although there have already been similar occurrences on Earth in former times through domineering, power-hungry, and mad-obsessed rulers, as a result of which so-called world empires have arisen. But what has arisen since the existence of the USA with regard to striving for world domination is currently happening and will continue to happen, will not find its equal at any time. Unfortunately, however, the majority of the U.S. population and Earth humans care little or not at all about this because, on the one hand, they have faithfully fallen for the U.S. political press and political propaganda positions and, on the other hand, they are controlled by their fraudulent false reports, deceitful machinations, and outrageous lies. A fact which, however, is not recognized by believers in this regard because of their inability for and lack of clear and truthful judgment, which reveals stupidity, lack of intelligence, and ignorance. On the other hand, there is also that part of the U.S. American population and the worldwide U.S. supporters, or rather the majority, who believe in the U.S. political press and political propaganda, and consequently believe in the media. This means that these U.S. proponents blindly trust anything that is deceitfully and hypocritically presented worldwide by lie propaganda in public media such as newspapers, journals, and political magazines, as well as radio and television broadcasts. So they accept every lie and every deception without hesitation and contradiction and accept that they are misled, lied to, and deceived. And that this is the way it is and has always been done by the USA is without any doubt, whereby without exception also in all states of Europe, also in Switzerland, but also in many other states of the world, many America-friendly journalists, writers, and numerous unscrupulous and also U.S. American-oriented media controlled from the USA unhesitatingly spread the USA lie propaganda as alleged truth. This, in turn, of course, means that the large media readership that believes in the USA is lied to, deceived and controlled by the USA itself and by the public media, but this is not realized by the naive and stupid USA followers. It is a fact that many public media worldwide, which unfortunately also include certain Swiss media, especially well-known European newspapers, magazines, radio and television stations, journalists, organizations, and unneeded, fanatical, lacking in understanding and reason, and friendly supporters of the USA and the EU dictatorship are directly or indirectly influenced and controlled by the USA and the EU dictatorship. Through these media, in the manner of the USA and EU dictatorship, false accusations of alleged warmongering against Russia are hurried, spurred on, and lied out, precisely that Russia does not want peace but war and is working towards triggering a Fourth World War. This, however, corresponds to a malicious lying slander that is supposed to force Russia to act according to the will of the USA and the EU dictatorship. And this thinking and acting of the USA, as well as of the U.S. Vasallan Union EU dictatorship, as well as of the U.S. American-friendly media and the blind, naive USA followers, I must describe not only as impertinence, but also as abomination, maliciousness, stupidity, hatefulness, insidiousness, perfidy, nefariousness, villainy, impudence, vulgarity, and as an unparalleled criminal act. The truth is that Russia is holding back against all lying, sanctioning, and slanderous attacks of the USA and EU dictatorship because it is not Russia that does not want peace. The warmongers who do not want peace but war are the USA and the EU dictatorship. Because, as has been the case since time immemorial, US America wants to achieve world domination, while the EU dictatorship is out to extend its dictatorship across the entire European continent. Although Europe is the smallest continent on Earth, it currently comprises 47 states, 28 of which are already included in the EU dictatorship. And these EU dictatorship states and the USA, as well as their blind followers and all the naive advocates, are the ones who are inciting war against Russia, who want war instead of peace, and who are doing everything they can to bring about a Cold War again. And this can very quickly become a reality through the felonious machinations of the USA and the EU dictatorship. If the peoples themselves do not finally remove the power-obsessed and government-incapable of these two dangerous powers from office and replace them with peace-building, righteous, people-loving, and capable of governing people. And this stupid, foolish, and unreasonable following also does not perceive that the USA and EU dictatorship attack Russia by inciting war and impose unjustified sanctions. Because this country does not fit into the completely wrong and partisan US and EU dictatorial machinations. So there is also an unreasonable and blatant threat against Russia, which is holding back on threats, combat and war measures against the agitating tirades of the USA and the EU dictatorship and their accompanying vassals as ever, and does not allow itself to be provoked to take up arms only when all possibilities for avoiding war have been exhausted. However, the USA and the EU dictatorship know this very well, and why they are taking false, unjustified, provocative sanctioning measures against Russia with the aim of forcing it to take ill-considered and unreasonable actions and to participate. So the effort and the hopeful expectation that Russia would lose its nerve and resort to warlike actions against the West are also underhanded in the whole behavior. As can be seen from our factual and behavioral analyses of the hopes of the USA and the EU dictatorship, this would force the USA and the EU dictatorship, and thus the entire EU dictatorship states, to join forces with their military powers and wage a war of defeat against Russia. This could then provoke a Fourth World War, by which, if Russia were defeated, the USA and the EU dictatorship would make many annexations of states, and the USA could satisfy its greed for world domination, and the EU dictatorship could satisfy its desire to accumulate states. Such a Fourth World War, during which China, England, Canada, most of Africa and South America, Australia, and various other states, including Switzerland, would also be forced to act, would mean that further and additional catastrophic climate destruction would be caused. Ultimately, however, there would also be enormous destruction of the Earth's surface and nature, as well as the fauna and flora. As well as an enormous number of human achievements, many areas would be depopulated, and an incalculable number of land areas would become barren and uninhabitable. This would fulfill the last prophesied catastrophe, the two-thirds extermination of the Earth's world population, which has been prophesied since ancient times. But there would also be the possibility that U.S. America, as well as the EU dictatorship, with its planned armies would only involve Russia in their power mania, and possibly only a few with this ally and would wage war on it. In order to realize the incorporation of the EU dictatorship states into Europe and Eurasia in the event of a victory. And if the USA were also involved, then they too could realize their world domination plans. And the fact that since time immemorial the effective facts of U.S. world domination have been geared to this is undoubtedly certain. This, of course, is connected with the criminal activities of the secret services, political activities, war crimes, and even criminal economic activities that have cost many millions of lives to date. A fact, however, which is not recognized worldwide, especially by the entire leadership and supporters of the EU dictatorship, as well as by the entire global supporters of the US-America world population, which is based on their stupidity and incompetence, because reality and truth are not recognized. And all those citizens of the USA, on the other hand, have no chance to do anything that is righteous and disagrees with the whole of the American world domination addiction and all of the inhuman machinations of the USA, because they simply have to keep quiet and make a good face of it, as is the case with the EU dictatorship. They are like the proponents of US America and EU dictatorship in Switzerland and in the EU dictatorship itself, which I also want to cite, not capable of a clear mindfulness, attention, consideration, and the real perception of the effective reality and its truth. And this is because on the one hand they are impaired in their intelligence, and on the other hand they are also unable to recognize, consider, and judge clearly given facts logically. Their cognition or their conscious perception of reality and its truth is very limited and therefore extremely deficient, because their conscious and cognitive inertia prevents them from perceiving the signals from the environment and consequently from processing the effective facts. Billy. Cognitive derives from the Latin cognoscere, which can be translated as to recognize. In fact, it has to be said that they are fools who believe in fools, who bewitch and mislead them, and can therefore be said, fools believe fools and fools lead fools. But when it comes to the machinations of the USA, which have since ancient times been intended to lead to the realization of their craving for world domination, it is absolutely certain that these violate all defined human rights and laws of war. Fundamentally, the whole thing is controlled by US America through actions that are murderous, by Secret Service, military, acts of war crimes, criminal and unconstitutional, political, world community damaging, economic, whereby the criminal and felonious machinations of the USA are hyped up worldwide by many irresponsible media. The effective truth of the US-American Secret Service, military and political mentality for might over the world knows no bounds, whereby also the unrighteous part of the U.S. people who share the same reflecting play along and grant the might-obsessed and world domination addicts every help and felonious machinations. And this is so while that righteous part of the U.S. citizens who wants peace, racial equality rights, comprehensive humanity, no death penalty and comprehensive justice in their own country and throughout the world, and who is committed to it in various peaceful forms, who is shouted down, humiliated, hushed up, or, if possible, still punished, who is accused of being enemies of the state and persecuted in court. And that this is indeed the case, as it is in many other countries of the world, is a farce without equal. And this is because those autocratic politicians, lawmakers and rulers, who only exercise their power and disregard others, who are not like-minded in the same offices, do not egoistically and unscrupulously shy away from taking action against all those who are human thinkers and righteous in their senses and aspirations for justice, peace, equality, and humanity with force of arms and intent to kill. But it is a fact that these righteous people in the USA, as well as in all other states of Earth, are not able to enforce their intentions in this respect, because their goal given in this way is not taken seriously by all those unrighteous politicians. Lawmakers and rulers and all their henchmen of any kind who only exercise their power and exploit, harass, and force under their thumb the people governed by them. The righteous in the USA and in all other countries of the world are thus only ridiculed, mocked, and if possible harassed and punished for their efforts by the unrighteous of politics, governments, lawmakers, and all unrighteous who serve them if they stand up for peace, freedom, equality, equal rights, humanity, and racial equality, and for a legislation without death penalty for all people. In addition, those who disagree in this respect, the proponents of the reason of state, support the striving of the state with unjust and inhumane self-assertion of the state by any means. This in addition to the fact that racial hatred organizations and criminal organizations also help to suppress and even murder the righteous of every skin color and race when they express their righteous opinion and demand an end to everything inhuman. But with regard to the USA, the following is to be said, namely that world peace since the existence of this United States is not only endangered by its politics alone, but also again and again by worldwide U.S. Secret Service and U.S. warlike interferences and actions which disturb everything and make any peace-promoting progress impossible. So the USA, practically since its inception, has been sneakily interfering autocratically and world domination addicted in the dealings of foreign countries by bringing them into turmoil through Secret Service actions, in order to then invade them militarily and start and carry out open acts of war, and henceforth act as an occupying power in the defeated country. It is also a fact that through the U.S. war propaganda and the world police airs and graces hidden in it, as well as through the greed for world domination and world power, the world media has been manipulated since the existence of the USA to draw the peoples of various states to the U.S. side and swear them into it. Furthermore, those citizens in their own country who are stupid authority-blind believers and neither want to recognize nor perceive reality or truth, because they are too lazy, unworldly, foolish, incapable of logical thinking and morbidly autocratic, will be seduced by unfair machinations and lies in their own country, because they are unable to perceive their own limitation of consciousness. So as truth blinds, they are unable to recognize the criminal, inhuman and criminal machinations of certain U.S. Secret Services, U.S. military, or the bellicosity of those U.S. politicians, rulers and their followers, who are unscrupulous and believe in their delusion that all those possessed of power and their henchmen of all kinds would act for the security and welfare of the USA and its population. Since the existence of the USA, countless deadly and destructive conflicts have been caused by this country and its powerful statesmen, military, politicians, and secret services in many states of Earth, namely begun in the own country with the extermination attempts concerning the indigenous Indians, as well as with Civil War actions, the First World War of 1756 to 1763, etc., which is still represented only as 7 Years' War, however quite consciously not as First World War. This, too, is a U.S. calculation in order not to have to confess guilt and to be the trigger for this 7-year world war. In the USA, however, it also went on with human robbery. When criminal U.S.-American human robbers and human traffickers in Africa robbed, beat up, maltreated, and brought natives to early U.S. America as slaves by force of evil, whereby countless people died on the transport alone. But this was even worse, because the white immigrants from Europe, who were often criminals or sectarians, and were therefore expelled by the authorities from their homelands to early America or fled there themselves, developed into domineering slave owners, slave thugs, and slave murderers. In addition to the fact that early on many of the immigrants from Europe developed into racial haters, hunted down slaves and murdered them, with the Ku Klux Klan sect in particular committing the worst crimes in this respect, and still commits them today. along with other criminal, murderous, and criminal racial hatred organizations or groups, which in the USA as white radicals against blacks, Jews, etc., are the most important in this respect, and other foreigners and murder them, whereby in some places police forces shoot particularly harmless African Americans on the open street allegedly in self-defense, or beat them to death. All kinds of conflict induction in the USA all over the world have thus been preserved to the present day. And as a result, the same U.S. conflict behavior continues to be carried out in various places in various states, costing many lives and causing immense destruction. The very injustices and murderous acts done in Syria with its devastating bombardments of the civilian population, causing hundreds and thousands of deaths, are the result of air raids by U.S. F-16 and A-10 fighter planes. But the world media report on this in a very questionable way, especially the U.S. American-friendly media of Europe, which unfortunately also includes, I would like to say, Switzerland with its various media, which, due to their neutrality with regard to war reports, should also behave neutrally and factually as well as truthfully, but which is not done in favor of the USA. Also, U.S. American and European media regularly publish questionable and completely uncovered propaganda videos of the Islamist State or Islamist State, of the IS terrorists, with the actual IS massacres appearing only as a side note in the media, supposedly not to shock the viewers, but whereby mankind is not confronted with the effective truth and therefore does not know what actual atrocities are happening, both by the U.S. Air Force and by the IS terrorists, the regular Syrian army and the air force of the criminal dictator Bashar al-Assad. So the U.S. Air Force, the Syrian army, and the Syrian Air Force are bombing and murdering the Syrian civilian population, while the IS terrorist organization can continue its murderous mischief. On the contrary, however, the U.S.-driven media in Europe is spreading enormous lie reports, making the readership completely misoriented. Moreover, in certain cases there is cooperation between U.S. military and IS terrorists. Whether consciously or unconsciously, this must remain open, but it is a fact and therefore not only a suspicion, because it corresponds to the circumstances, as well as various cooperation with other terrorist and criminal organizations, which are supported by Secret Service and military, etc., at least with weapons and government overthrow aid, but which is vehemently denied by the USA. And it is also a fact that through this cooperation it is always possible for the IS terrorists after the U.S. air attacks to advance to the Syrian positions, as well as to places and to carry out their murderous massacres. The U.S. military and the U.S. Air Force operate in Syria not only with ground explorers and informants, but especially with AWACS planes, drones and satellites, as well as with German Phantom reconnaissance aircraft, whereby very exact data are determined. Thus, no accidental attacks during bombardments take place, but quite consciously fixed targets are approached and masses of people from the civilian population are murdered with bomb hail. A fact which U.S. America has always practiced without hesitation and conscience and murdered countless people, as in 1945 in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as in Germany in Schweinfurt, where with the Operation Double Strike, with 224-engine U.S. bombers in August 1943, a bombardment was set up on the German ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt. But 158 of the flying fortresses were shot down or damaged. Then, likewise, the air raid and the bombardment on Leipzig on the 4th of December 1943 should also be mentioned, which unleashed a tremendous firestorm and cost the lives of thousands of human beings. But there are many other U.S. war crimes to mention, such as Afghanistan, Vietnam, Iraq, etc., and so on. Another fact is that the U.S. War Department, that is to say the Pentagon always and practically in every case, denies the effective facts with lies and deceit, and presents everything differently and as unrealistic for the benefit of the U.S. These U.S. American excuse lies and fraud propaganda are, of course, adopted by the European and other media all over the world in order to keep the USA clean of war crimes and to cover up violent assaults and murders of the civilian population or to make their proven perpetration appear in a good light. Not infrequently, also lying excuses become loud in such a way that apparently an alleged enemy position was, unfortunately accidentally, bombed by American fighter planes and therefore civilians were killed. And it is quite obvious that the U.S.-friendly media of all European states are spreading propaganda in the sense of the USA over and over again, instead of naming and publishing the effective facts of what the military, air forces, and secret services of the USA are really doing about war crimes with the consent of their government. That would be the real task of all media around the world, thus also in all states of the EU dictatorship, as well as in neutral Switzerland, which by truthful lying media, unneutral journalists, and by wrong U.S.-American lie and pseudo-reports pull neutrality into the dirt, mock and make a mockery of it. So what is really being done by the media is a propaganda ploy that is spreading more and more in Europe and around the world, and through which all the hard facts of reality and its truth are trampled underfoot, portrayed as questionable and ridiculed outright.
All that you have said means that, from my point of view, I can make it a general summary of people and their behavior, without having to deal explicitly with the machinations of the USA and the EU dictatorship. And by humans, I mean, of course, Earth humans who should do exactly what is taught by the mission teaching or the spiritual teaching, or the teaching of the truth. Teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life, namely that man must learn to do the right thing and the valuable thing out of himself. This means that he has to teach himself everything, to learn, to help himself, to explain everything to himself, even to contradict himself, to reprimand himself. To teach, to correct, to understand everything, to form his thoughts and feelings by himself, and of course to implement all learned knowledge for his own benefit, and also to act himself. And this is what the man of Earth has to do without allowing himself to be influenced believingly by the sneaky and lousy machinations of unjust governments, their followers of all kinds and of foreign states, or by religions, sects, and false or simply dubious philosophies, etc. But man has to do this alone and of his own free will, which is why he must be instructed in this matter even in his earliest education and encouraged to his own thinking, to his own finding of truth, and to his own decision, as well as to his own righteous action according to his own will. First and foremost, of course, the human being can be provided with the necessary educational endowments or explanations and instructions in the form of teaching. Basically, the human being must have the freedom to use his ability and to be autonomous and to remain so. Consequently, he can set himself all necessary life values and life goals in personal freedom. It also means, however, that he must be able to understand and follow everything in his actions and deeds in a righteous manner, and that he must be absolutely independent of any external or other outside influence. The personal freedom of will must of course always be in the foreground and also remain, because there is no continuous causal determination of the actions by external influences or by internal conditions, such as genetic predeterminations and predispositions, or physical determining prerequisites specially oriented to something, which would inevitably have to be done, as determinism claims to the contrary. Effectively, the fact is correct, as is also shown by indeterminism, that man has freedom of will and that he decides, controls, executes, and carries out everything by his own will. If he is conscious of himself and does not allow himself to be influenced and duped by whispers and suggestive and deceitfully formed convictions, ideologies, lies, and deceit, etc. of others. So external influences can never correspond to such a destiny that it could do something beyond man's will and control man's will, because in every case and whatever it is, man himself decides about his will. So man always determines and decides for himself whether he wants to do or refrain from doing something, be it in relation to his own desires, necessities, reason or desires, etc., or be it in relation to work instructions from superiors. Any demands, actions, or deeds which are demanded from other people, from the family, from authorities, military, courts, organizations, from the environment, or from life itself. So man must not allow the influence of other men on his will and his will to be allowed in order to make and carry out a decision. But he must always make his first and last concrete decisions personally according to his own free will and in an uninfluenced way, because only in this way can his will and self-determination come into effect. This also means that man of earth is not to be influenced by political press and political propaganda, nor by public media such as newspapers, journals, radio and television, etc., nor by suggestive speeches, but in each case, effectively in each case, should always use his own intellect and reason to find out the effective truth. And only then, when he has found it with the highest possible certainty, he should, can, and may he bring himself to a good, correct, and righteous decision and put it into action by his very own will. This, however, requires a lot of effort and research in order to find the truth, which cannot be achieved simply by false and dishonest media reports, etc., and by influences of any kind, and as a result of followers or sympathy, but only by effectively thorough research, neutral thoughts and considerations regarding the given facts. And only then, when the whole thing is handled in this way, also the effective truth can be found, and according to this, a righteous and free opinion can be created, and through this also a righteous decision concerning the correctness can be made. And in order to then implement this decision in reality, further thoughts and considerations are needed in order to form the very own will, and to bring about a conversion of an action or act into free will. Ethics, too, effectively understands freedom of will to mean what the term says. But it must also be said that freedom of will is not simply an arbitrariness of being able to do and let go, and thus not an arbitrariness, but an autonomous, correct, righteous and moral self-determination and self-disposal, which demand that decency, compassion, humanity, helpfulness, and the order with regard to necessary laws and recommendations as well as the fulfillment of duties are observed. And this is so because the freedom of will of the individual or the human being is the prerequisite for his moral gift, his entire correct behavior and his obligations. So, in other words, the essence of man is not simply in thinking, recognizing, acting and doing, but especially in his will, which is controlled by him through understanding and reason in legality, righteousness and self-responsibility through which he accomplishes, exercises, acts and does everything in a conscious and regulated way. The will of the individual human being is free and not subordinated to any powers, a deity, a higher will of the world or other human beings, because the human being as such and individual leads and directs himself in full responsibility in every respect, starting from all his thoughts, feelings, other impulses and actions, but also in relation to his speech, his correct, cultivated and clean way of speaking, which has to be far away from all obscene, ordinary, and vulgar expressions. Exactly this, however, is not the case with those indecent people who cultivate an amoral, abusive, characterless, culture-low, naive, vulgar, shameless, incorrect, and immoral use of language, in which they also cross their path with regard to all their actions, and behavior. Such people often interfere without thought and without being asked in the conversations of others who do not concern them, make stupid and primitive remarks and disregard the rights of their fellow human beings. And they often do this without themselves being in principle directly to blame for it, but only indirectly, on the one hand because in their childhood their parents or other legal guardians, to which also the pedagogues, so-called clergymen and professional teachers, etc., belong, did not fulfill their educational duty, and did not sufficiently instruct them with regard to decency and behavior. On the other hand, however, the direct blame lies in the fact that from puberty until adulthood, the self-responsibility of self-education was not perceived, and consequently they do not know any decency. In this way, the whole thing also applies to those politicians and rulers and their direct and indirect followers who, without decency and self-opinionated, disregard the rights of the people and treat them from above down in a domineering and condescending manner, harassing, incapacitating and subjugating them by unjust measures, decrees and unjust laws, commandments, fines and taxes, etc. Thus, in certain ways, large and small correlations can be seen in relation to impropriety, abusiveness, shamelessness, incorrectness and unrighteousness, etc. both among ordinary citizens or people and among authorities, in politics, in world affairs and religions, sects and organizations, even though they fundamentally do not concern the interests of others. Self-righteous people, who determine freedom and right impairing and will influencing over other people up to killing by warlike or death-depreding actions and deeds, are outside of every righteous human and social norm. By this I mean especially certain unjust officials, politicians and rulers as well as their lackeys, as well as presidents, leaders, bosses, executioners, warlords and educators of all kinds, who interfere shamefully in the freedom and private affairs, as well as in the rights and free decision of will of their subordinates, of the faithful, etc., and even of all people of whole populations, in order to harass them, to oppress them, to train them, and in doing so also to disregard their rights and to trample them underfoot. It is a fact that such weak people, who are not infrequently civil servants, rulers, military personnel, educators, clergymen, sect bosses or superiors, etc., and who are well educated in a variety of school knowledge, have actually learned to know what decency, peace, freedom, harmony, law and order as well as correct human behavior, etc., is all about, but are also psychopathically inclined, and consequently consider their fellow human beings less than themselves and harass them. Such people want to rule over others, which is why they disdain them, violate them disregardingly, discriminate against them, even oppress them, insult them, despise them, practice an insulting and cutting behavior towards their fellow human beings, and do not recognize that they are not only unprofessional, but also of an inferior character with regard to their dealings with fellow human beings, and thus do everything possible to cause and promote discord and thus hatred and war. The fact that they are also playing along with lack of discipline, stupidity and cowardice, as well as lack of intelligence, and that there is a tremendous lack of humanity among them, as well as weakness, self-assertion and selfishness. They are just as unable to recognize in their egoism and arrogance as they are not able to recognize everything else about them in relation to the negative, evil, and bad that they do and embody. And unfortunately, I have to talk about the USA now, because the majority of its population agrees with the racist, war criminal, death penalty related and world domination greedy machinations of the USA. This majority is in agreement with all evil and negativity in a supportive way, and roars with it when people are condemned to death by the USA on the basis of its often false and inhuman laws, executed and caused mischief and discord in foreign countries by ordinances and Secret Service actions, and when acts of war are carried out all over the world. This is also true for the fact that the majority of the proponents cheerfully roar along pro and cheerfully when the USA plays world police and tries to enforce world domination, airs and graces, etc., with acts of war around the world, from which the righteous minority of the U.S. citizens is of course excluded in any case. On the whole, everything in the USA is going exactly in the direction that every criminal and criminal act and action of the ruling warmongers and their vassals, the racists and death penalty criers, coincides for the masses that run along and howl along and the majority of the population that advocates everything. The same also applies to the EU dictatorship, which is horny for Europe, wants to build its own army and join the USA in warfare in order to fulfill its own interests. Just like the USA, which conducts its negotiations with other states, especially with Russia, as I can watch on news broadcasts again and again, with absolutely stubborn demands and snubs its negotiating partners rebelliously, stubbornly and hard-boiled in complete stiffness and arrogance and incites them to negation. The EU dictator pack with its pathologically stupid demands is also driving and forcing its interlocutor Russia into a corner, negation and defense, as well as with the idiotic sanctions. The beanstraw stupidity of the misgoverning EU dictatorship clique and the USA can be seen in everything they do, and therefore with frightening clarity, that all these morbidly stupid government brainwashers are not in a position to grasp the dangerous situation. They are causing and conjuring up with their demands for weakness and sanctions against Russia. Out of sheer stupidity and idiocy, as well as out of greed for power, they work on a war which they want to provoke at the expense of countless human lives, which would already be wiped out millions of times by underground threatening acts of war when they come about. Both the USA and the EU dictatorship or their powerful ones are absolutely incapable of making a suitable and useful compromise with Russia in order to put an end to all threats of war and to eliminate all disputes between all states. How simple would such a compromise be? For example, with regard to the Syrian catastrophe, which would consist of the fact that the world power-hungry USA would confine itself to limiting its fighting in the air and on the ground solely to the Islamist state in order to eliminate this great danger, which is aimed at murderously subjugating the world. This, while Russia is to be left alone, because it is in a relationship of dependence with the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad and is campaigning for the regular Syrian army and thus against the separatist combat troops. The reason for the dependency is the naval base Tartus, a naval base of the Syrian Navy in the Syrian port city of Tartus. This Syrian naval base occupies an area of 0.4 square kilometers, that is to say 40 hectares, and next to it the base is allocated an area of 1.5 hectares, which forms a small base, respectively a technical base of the Russian Navy, and has a pier that mainly consists of two floating piers of 120 m length each. The naval base in Tartus was and is used by the Soviet Union, and today Russia, since the signing of a bilateral agreement and treaty with Syria in 1971. At present, this is the only base in the Mediterranean that the Russian Navy maintains and uses. But it is precisely this factor that is a thorn in the side of the United States, because it is absolutely out of their league that Russia has direct access to the Mediterranean. However, the world public knows little or nothing about this, and consequently little or nothing is known about why the USA is doing its military warlike mischief in Syria and why Russia is campaigning for the regular Syrian army, and thus also for Bashar al-Assad. But now that the US is sneakily bombing both the Islamist state and at the same time the regular Syrian army, it is natural that stink was pre-programmed from the very beginning and will remain if the necessary compromise is not reached. However, the USA is not interested in this because they are disposing of their outdated war material in Syria and earn a lot of money with it, but can also rearm with new and more modern war material. However, the USA does not want to let all the new and more modern war material simply become outdated again, but to use it for new purposes, namely by using it itself in secret military actions as well as in open acts of war, the originators of which are basically the USA and its secret services. For this reason, they have been trying since time immemorial to create new hotbeds of revolution and war by means of underhand secret service, criminal, felonious, political and military machinations, whereby it is also common practice in the USA to train guerrillas and other elements of foreign countries in secret training camps, which then create turmoil or terror organizations in their own homeland or in foreign states. And of course they are then supported by the USA with the latest weapons, etc., and money before the insurgents or terrorists themselves turn against the USA.
These two are facts that are neither considered nor understood by the world population. But we should not pursue these things any further today. What I can tell you is our result regarding your question 4 months ago regarding the number of Earth humans. Just how many are currently engaged in learning your mission or teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life? The clarifications in this regard were unfortunately laborious and extensive, and it took more than 4 months to obtain perfect results. Because we first had to call on the help of the sonar for the purpose of clear registration, because our possibilities for such a task were limited. So we were allowed to use their technology, which allows highly sensitive and extremely accurate analyses and recordings, which were not yet within our own scope of development, but which we are now allowed to include in our development programs. But let's get to the point. The results of our investigations were extremely amazing and unexpected for all of us. Because if we do not count the core group members and the passive members, who together are about 550, as you said, then the interest in your mission has awakened in many people on Earth. This is due on the one hand to the conscious and unconscious multifaceted, Worldwide activities of these 550 official members, as well as to the FIGU website in particular, and all Internet publications of all FIGU groups in different languages. Internet connections and those interested in the Internet are increasing remarkably well, as is the verbal, Internet, and speech propagation of mission concerns, which has led to the emergence of a considerable number of terrestrial people with great interest. Also, many FIGU writings, your books, and much of the FIGU Internet are privately translated into other languages and distributed to families. Acquaintances and friends, as are many who talk and discuss with each other as well as learn from it, strive to obey the values of teaching and make them their own in a way they can. So from all your efforts in spreading the mission and your work, a very great success has emerged, which is really amazing. In fact, many people on earth all over the world can be addressed by the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life because they seek their intellect, their reason, their sense, and their will for a personal, inner, conscious, and behavioral manner, and find in the teaching what they have been searching for all their lives. And since they follow the teaching and are successful with it, they are also consciously trying to familiarize their fellow human beings with it in one way or another.
That is very pleasing, about which all passive and core group members will be pleased likewise, because now we know that our work and all our efforts are not in vain, but fruitful. And it also says that even all the unpleasantness that is brought to us or done to us by domineering and selfish group apostates, malevolence, insults to us as a sect, as well as by lies, slander, traitors, and adversaries, etc., is useless and to the malevolent's own harm, but, as always, to our benefit and advantage.
This is in fact the case, because it is good that you and all core group and passive members do not let yourselves be harassed by any kind of nastiness on the part of those who insult you, those who know better, those who are evil, those who liar, those who slander you, and those who condemn you, etc. Do not pay attention to disparagement, as certain former members of the association reveal through their low-mindedness, because they were not able to express in the association their egoism, their self-importance, self-righteousness, and pathological arrogance, and not to push themselves into the foreground by joining the association.
We should not really talk about it anymore, because it only triggers bad memories. What is certainly more important, however, is that you name the number of people who, according to your clarifications, are currently occupied with teaching and our mission. I am afraid you did not say that.
I will. Through my discussion, I did not mention the result, which I now want to mention. Our investigations have recorded the very astonishing number of 21,461 Earth humans that resulted from the completion of our worldwide and extremely precise investigation work. And this result has resulted from people on Earth who speak different languages and live in 116 countries.
Wow.
Yes, it is very amazing and exceeds all our expectations. But now, Edward, I must go, dear friend. Goodbye, because it is really time for me to go, because I still have some duties to perform.
But I want to say thanks, dear friend. Farewell and see you soon, Ta.